Hey guys, just wanted to go over some human anatomy reference before we get started. These are all from a book I bought in Shanghai. It kind of compiles all the best anatomy reference, sculptures, anatomical illustrations, all that stuff. It just really helps to understand what's going on underneath the skin, just seeing where the muscle attaches to the bones, how it attaches, where it attaches, is it a soft transition, hard transition. Just all really important stuff to understand before we get into our primate studies. Just having stuff like this on the side while you're working is going to be really useful. Here's another page of reference, same book, but it's just really good to understand all this stuff. Like here's the skull, here's how the muscles attach to the skull, here's the skin on top of the muscles, and just getting a really deep understanding of how all these things work together to make us move around and live. And yeah, just the more you know, the better and smoother things will go once we get into our chimpanzee reference and start seeing things. It's like, oh, what is that? And if you understand all this stuff or have it handy on the side, you can easily go, oh, okay, that's the cheekbone, and this bulge I'm seeing right here is this muscle that goes up and attaches to this part on the skull. And so you're cutting out any guesswork as you move forward with the sculpt, and just it'll really help you just get that depth of understanding that I want you guys to take out of this exercise. So I just want to touch briefly on comparative anatomy, picking something fairly close to us and just showing you how it's very related to one another. So this human being sculpture and gorilla sculpture on the right, and just showing you how it's the same muscles just applied to a different structure. So again, once you understand how human anatomy works, you can really apply it to many different types of mammals, which I'll go into in a second. Just understanding how all mammals are related to one another, and how once you understand this basic framework, even though we're going to be using a chimpanzee to gain this understanding, it applies to human beings, it applies to a lion, a leopard, every type of mammal. You can, once you understand this, you can say, oh, okay, well, that's where the bicep muscle is attached to the chest, and that's where it attaches to the arm, but it's just a different configuration, but you can see how it translates to this different structure. And I guess that's what I kind of want to get across, and again, what I want you to get out of this exercise. So here's another page I put together. The bottom is again from that anatomy book, and the top is me just trying to understand the underworkings of this orangutan. So I started with the skull, and then taking the anatomy reference below, trying to paint on the muscles, just so I can understand what's going on underneath, because this orangutan has all this extra flesh and these kind of crests on the side of its face, and a lot of it was just me sculpting an orangutan and just getting stuck and just saying, like, what's going on underneath this part, like what's happening here. And this is just me, again, just going back to the reference and trying to get a better depth of understanding so that I can go back to my sculpture and say, oh, okay, well, I know that the muscle's attached here, so I better make this form stand out a bit more, cut this form in. Just trying to solve this problem as best I can. So here's another page of comparative anatomy, but taking it a bit further than just relating the human skeleton with a gorilla skeleton, just showing you all mammals are related to one another. It's the same structure, the same bones, just in a different configuration, which you can see the relationship in the upper right corner of just a human to a cat to a whale to a bat. Like, it's just all the same structure. So what I want you to get out of this is just having that depth of understanding and giving you a more objective view of looking at reality, which will allow you, again, to, when you do start making up imaginary creatures, kind of make something that's a bit more believable based on the way things have adapted and grown on the planet Earth for, billions of years. So coming at things from that standpoint, I think will lead to much more believable and realistic creature designs. So yeah, just another thing to keep in the back of your mind as a mental note as you move forward. And so here's just a little bit of sculpture reference. This is from a group of guys called Kennis and Kennis, which you can find online on their website. They do reconstructions for museums and like National Geographic, and basically taking old skulls and fossils and visualizing what that would have looked like. So taking some primitive man sculpture, some Neanderthal or something, and maybe the skull is halfway there, but they can make an educated guess based on what they know of reality and complete the skull, then put the muscles on the skull, and give a very accurate view of what that person would have looked like. And which is essentially what we're doing, what this exercise is giving you a depth of understanding that you can then go and create all these things for yourself. We're doing it in 3D, whereas they do it in traditional sculpting and clay and stuff. But that depth of understanding is something that I think very few creature designers maybe do. So I think, again, this will just build your visual library to a much higher level than normal, and just give you a big resource to draw from as you move forward in your artwork. So now I just want to get into just the kind of pages of reference I would put together before starting on a sculpture. Just, going to Google, going to bone clones, finding bone scans from digimorph.org or places like that, just so I have as big of an understanding or as full of a picture of this creature as possible. So I have views of the skin, I have views of the bone, and I can really just kind of start to see how it all fits together in my head, just to give me as much resources as possible while I'm working on all this stuff. And sometimes I'll go in and say, like the skeleton on the left, maybe I'll get stuck and want to understand these forms that I'm seeing and start sketching in the muscles, like how the pectoral muscle attaches to the sternum, and how all these, basically making sense of all the forms I'm seeing in the reference, because sometimes they're covered in fur or sometimes there's things obstructing them. So it's just going in and starting to sketch all this stuff out on the muscles and get all this stuff ready, do the research, just so you're ready to go as you get sculpting. Reference, we're not really gonna get into this since we're just doing the face, but just giving you an idea of the type of things I would collect. The skull scans from Digimorph, which are all just real life skulls, and just gonna flip through a few more pages of reference to give you an idea of the type of reference I collect for all this stuff. And also something to touch on is just as you're collecting your reference or picking a subject to study, try to find not the most common version of that animal. So for example, these are a bunch of chimpanzee studies, and when I think of a chimpanzee, I probably think of something like the guy in the kind of middle left, dark fur, pink face. But there's so many variations of these animals, and that just have so much life and character to them, and it's just understanding and seeing the depth of variety that's in nature is just really inspiring. And there's chimps that feel like they're extremely old and wise, or just have a lot of history, or lived a long life, or just a lot of expression and character that comes out of these faces and animals in the wild. And just really doing a lot of research to find like the most interesting version of that thing that you're trying to create will, again, just build your visual library and allow you to push forward and add that much more depth to your imaginary works. Let's just dive right into this. I'm going to be blocking this out with kind of basically just use like 4 or 5 basic sculpting tools. You can see I'm just blocking these out with the snake hook right now. You can see the skull reference on the right. Those are actually CAT scans from a real chimpanzee skull, which you can find on websites like digimorph.org. Just a good resource to have for your future studies. The main reason I wanted to make this DVD was because just maybe for like professionals or guys starting out who want to help just build up their visual library, and maybe guys who've been working for a while that maybe feel like their work's getting stale or stagnant, or they feel like something's wrong but they don't know what. And I think going back to nature and studying the way things grow is probably the best sort of way of self-correction and understanding design the way it exists in the real world. So whenever that happens to me, I tend to go back to nature and maybe do a study like this, and then I go look back at what my creature was looking like, and you're just like, oh, well, that doesn't work that way, or this should look that way. And it just will allow you to draw from a much deeper well than if you hadn't otherwise. And so you can see again with the snake hook, pulling out those teeth. And the reason I use snake hook as opposed to something else is, hopefully you can see by now, it just naturally pulls things to a point. And so teeth, fingers, a lot of these forms on the skull, you can just see it naturally will be thicker at a base, and the further it goes out, it comes to a point or just is less thick than at the base, and Snakehook naturally gets that into your forms that you pull out. So it just, I feel like from the start it naturally will get all that in there, and you have much less work to do later on. It'll automatically feel more organic and feel more like it's sort of real organic creature from nature. And you can see I'm trying to visually match up that proportion of that skull on the right to what I'm sculpting. There are some features in the later versions of ZBrush that allow the program to become transparent. You can kind of overlay on top of a photo or something, but I feel that's kind of a cheat in this case. I don't want you guys to just trace or copy a skull without thinking about it. So doing it this way is more like traditional figure drawing, where you're looking at your subject and kind of going back and forth, you know, with your eyes, just looking back and forth, and you kind of visually overlay what you're studying. I just feel like that's the best way to pick up a lot of this stuff. And that's one thing I want to get across, is just don't blindly copy this stuff. Like, try to think about why it's all there, why all these forms are there that you're seeing, why it looks the way it does, why are all these things in that place, and just really observe and think about how this thing is built, why some of these ridges are on the skull, how the muscles attach to those ridges. It'll become more apparent when we start looking at reference, and you'll see, like, okay, that's where the bone is poking through and the skin is very thin there, and here's where there's a lot more muscle and flesh on top and it's a bit more soft. And you can just start to see, by starting with the skull, you can start to really see how the muscles are built on top of that skull and the skin is on top of those muscles, and you can just almost see it all working together, just observing how all those things are put together to make that thing move around. And another thing to notice is that this skull is probably, it's in very good condition. It's probably some CAT scan of a zoo chimpanzee or something that had a pretty easy life in captivity. But once we get into our reference and stuff later, you'll see the teeth are really messed up, the head is irregular, it's got scars, it's got all these different things that really add to the character and add to the animal. Again, just all the stuff to add to your visual library for later when we start doing imaginary creatures. But using this as a base, this kind of clean, pristine skull, and then we kind of try to match it to a really interesting chimp in our reference. Don't be afraid to, you know, mess up the teeth, and really pay attention to how these things change as they live, you know, many years in the wild. Another thing you'll see me using the invert of the Damien standard to draw on that ridge on the side of the head. And again, that's where the that sort of hole-like structure we drew for the cheekbone, you know, the reason that's there is because the cheek muscle is attached to the jawbone. It goes underneath that ridge and is attached to the side of the head on that sort of circular area that I drew out with the Damien standard. And that's basically, that form that I drew in is sort of a thickening of the skull, where that jaw muscle goes in and attaches along that ridge to allow the animal to chew and scream and move its jaw. But again, just understanding all that stuff and why it's there for later on. So instead of just blindly copying, like, okay, why is that ridge there? Why is these teeth have this extra support on top? Why does the form from the nasal cavity flare out and add more thickening to the skull down to those main canines? Just thinking about all that stuff and why it's there, and understanding why these forms grow that way to support these secondary structures, and how the muscles fit on top of that, and how it moves in real life, and why all those things are there. All stuff you'll start picking up kind of naturally. Like, even if you're just, I keep going back to blindly copying, but even if you just copy it, you'll start to understand things even if you're not thinking about it, but it's better to think about it while you're doing it. So kind of going back in, and now the form's blacked out, just adding in secondary forms, refining the proportion and everything based on the skull we're looking at on the right. And we don't really see the bottom of the skull, but I'm still going to go in there and sculpt some of that just for me, just for personal understanding and development. And again, a lot of the stuff, say if you're on a job or something, you probably wouldn't sculpt that, but this is for yourself. This is for you to learn more and understand more. So don't try not to treat this like a contract job or something. Just treat this like this is personal time and development for yourself. Study as much as you can. You kind of start to see like an overall sort of abstract graphic design of how all these shapes. It's almost like, I don't know, you just start to get a sense for how things grow in nature, how forms are broken up, which you can then apply to your own imaginary creatures later on. Again, don't think of this as like you did this once and you put it in some folder in your computer and call it a day. Like, you can always come back to this. You can use this as a basis for future creature studies or future creature skulls that you can just modify. And if you're doing anything vaguely humanoid, you could use this as a base to sculpt over, so your imaginary creature design has a very strong understructure. So yeah, nothing's wasted. You're building your visual library, learning from reality and nature, and always a good thing. Trying to nail down that eye ridge area around the eye socket. You can start to see from the front view there's like a real strong triangular shape, and a triangle being just a very strong structural form in nature, and just in architecture and just natural forms. And you'll see kind of these shapes repeated, and all through the skull you'll just see ways that these triangular structural support forms will just pop in there the more you look. But again, it's quite interesting. Like, you can see that kind of triangular form. It's strengthened by the canines come down as an extension of that triangular form. So when it bites, it's just completely supported by the entire skull. All the pressure that comes into those top canines directly lined up and supported by the entire form of the skull. You can see I haven't really nailed it in my current sculpture on the top part of that skull. But if you look at the 3D scan on the right, you can just see like it's almost like a perfect triangle going from the lower canines up to the nose cavity into the thickened kind of area of the eye sockets. And it's just really interesting to see that. And you can kind of see it's like a reverse on the lower jaw form, but not as not as pronounced. But you can see when this animal grasps onto food or chews something, that form is built to support that pressure. Another thing to be aware of is most things, or I don't want to say all things, but most things in nature aren't evenly divided. You'll see this skull is, it's never 50% broken up. You'll see that maybe right now from a top view on the right in that 3D scan, you can see maybe it's like 60-40 or maybe 70-30. Again, it's just almost like a golden rule of design of just never splitting something in half, never making something evenly divided. You can just see it everywhere in nature. Just nothing is perfectly divided. And when you see that in a imaginary design, just something, it just feels like something's off. Going back and doing something like this and studying nature, you'll just kind of naturally pick up these sort of unwritten rules of the way the world works, or the way the world grows, and the way things naturally exist in the world. And by putting that into your own designs from imagination, it'll just be naturally stronger. I'm just going to get in there and we're going to start sculpting the actual chimpanzee on top of this skull. Right now I'm just inserted as a sphere into the scene. It's a new subtool and made it a Dynamesh. And now I'm just kind of using the snake hook to push it around and make it fit generally on top of this the skull that we sculpted in the last few chapters. masking off a little area in the back where the spine or the neck will be coming out, and just kind of dragging out the basic neck shoulder proportion that we'll get into sculpting later, using the inflate to give that a bit more volume, and then dynameshing where needed to give us more topology to push all this around. So you can see you can really quickly block all this out, and it may look like maybe a lot of work to do that sculpt that we just did, but you'll see in a bit when we start adding in details and things, you'll start cutting into the form with Damien Standard and saying, oh, well, that's where I think the eye goes, but then you start matching it up with the skull, and you're like, oh, wow, that's way off. And again, it's just, we spent the time to build that foundation, and now we're gonna, reap the benefits of all our hard work. Trying to get in those cheek muscles and define those cheekbones and things a bit more. And again, still working on the relationship from the ear to the eyes to the nose to the mouth. Really trying to get in that eye ridge. I kind of go back and forth a little bit because I really like the way that chimp eyebrow looks on the guy on the right, but I have some other reference that it's a little different, and I keep going back and forth a little bit. But I think ultimately I go for something more like the guy on the right. Just defining those, creases on the sides of the eye, and blocking in those wrinkles with the Damien Standard a little bit more. Again, it just starts becoming real subtle, like where does the skin hang off the cheekbones? How does it hang? How does that transition into the mouth form, that muzzle form, and how do those muscles and skin all attach underneath? And you can see I don't really have a strong defined cheekbone right now. I'm trying to get that in there and really play up that brow ridge, because it's quite a distinctive feature on these guys. I think right now it's a bit too much. I think it angles a bit more in on the sides, but I'll get to that in a bit. And same thing, just defining the mouth a bit more as well. And that's one thing I noticed a lot of my ex-students or past students struggling with, is just getting that volume on the lips. They would just cut things in, but not really pay attention to how thick or thin the lips are and how they touch together and what sort of form or shape that makes. Again, all this stuff is very subtle, and stuff that, we're still, even though it's a chimp, we're still familiar with all these features, and based on, just looking at ourselves in the mirror every single day of our life, if something's slightly off, we can kind of tell. So just really getting in there and trying to pay attention to that stuff, because it is quite subtle, and it will look a little weird if it's off just a little bit. So again, just kind of checking, comparing, contrasting, trying to get a feeling for what's working, what's not working. Right now the head, again, the back of the head, I feel like the mouth to eye is looking all right, but the head, too poofy, too inflated or something. Just need to focus on all these basic relationships, and I don't think it's helping that my reference right now is kind of quite odd angles, so I'm kind of interpreting a lot of things where I probably should be looking at a different set of reference or something a bit more straight on or side view. But again, it's do the best you can, find the best reference you can, and just go for it. It all becomes about these really subtle relationships between the eyes, the nose, the mouth, the ears, the overall head proportion. It's all back to like foundation drawing stuff, but we're just doing it in 3D, so it's a little more work because we have to do it in every angle at the same time. But again, I feel like this is probably the best way to understand all this stuff and learn all this stuff, because you can't really hide anything. It's easy to hide something in a drawing, and you draw it from one angle, and someone says, oh, well, do you know how to draw the other side? And you go, oh yeah, sure. But you've hidden it in some lines or loose sketch technique or something. But when it's in 3D and we can rotate around the entire thing, you can't hide anything. Basically, you have to figure out the entire problem, and your understanding or lack of understanding will show through quite quickly. Again, just trying to get those cheekbones in there. Noticing on that chimp on the right, that there's kind of like a really thick muscles and skin connecting to the eyes. Just feels a little soft in a way, but just really powerful and thick. So I'm just trying to get that in there. So I'm just going to get in there and start, again, adding more subtlety and going in the inflate brush and just, adding more volume to the neck, adding more volume to the nose area, cutting in a bit. You can see the Dynamesh is still quite low, so it's getting a little pixelated. Just turn that up when needed while you're sculpting, and click Add or Clear Your Mask. Same sort of stuff, just getting in there, really defining what exactly that lower eyelid looks like, how much it's hanging down. I'll get in there and push that right up close to the eyeball in a second. Again, with our skull in there, you can see it gives us a good sort of indicator if we get too far off. I cut into the nose right there, and you can just see the blue shining through. But in this case, again, we don't want to be too held back by that, because there is so much variation in these chimps in the wild. And right now I'm just kind of comparing how far my nose that I've sculpted is off of the top of the skull. And you can see maybe it was probably a bit too much volume, so I'm just kind of adjusting and putting all that into place. And again, not being too restricted. If you're trying to create a certain type of character, still use it as a good groundwork and framework, but don't let it rigidly hold you to that based on how your imagined chimpanzee or the one you're trying to reference from your photographs. Just trying to keep it within that framework. If it's has a scar or its head was caved in or in some battle or something, adjust the skull to fit requirements of the character you're building. I did some earlier orangutan studies, and the first one I didn't build a skull, and I was constantly struggling with how far the eyes sit in the head, and a lot of things that I was just eyeballing, again, from different forms of reference. And when I finished, I just thought to myself, yeah, that looks all right. And then after a day or two, I looked back at it and just kept feeling like, something doesn't look right. I don't know what it is. And then I did this exercise where I built the skull first, got all my reference of my orangutan skulls, and then put it inside of the eyeballed study. And man, there were so many things off. It was just like the eyes were way too far out from the skull, or way too far in, or the nose and muzzle volume was way too big. And again, this is the exercise for you to learn about anatomy and learn how animals, and in particular primates, are constructed, and just start building this understanding of the world that you can apply to everything else. But it's like going through that process for myself. I don't even have to think about it now. When you start something, you constantly will be thinking about that. If you're making some imaginary creature, okay, what does the skull look like? Or if it is something, you could take it even that far. So you're building some, say, imaginary aquatic creature or something, you can, maybe you block out the form and you just kind of think, okay, what is the skeleton going to look like on this? Maybe it's slightly based on a whale. Look at the type of forms and bones in the whale and how the flesh and skin fits on top of that, and kind of interpret that sort of forms you're seeing and the way it attaches to skin, and apply that to your imaginary creature and build that as an understructure, and then figure out how the skin and bone and fat and muscle all attach on top of this imaginary creature that you're starting to make. Just a very good, logical way to design creatures, and I think the best creature designers that I look up to all kind of do that as well. So it's definitely something to try for yourself. So to polypaint, you need to go up to the top where it says RGB, and usually RGB is turned on and Z add or Z sub is turned on, and just make sure RGB is turned on. Now I'm just going through, and then when you touch the model, it will paint instead of change the geometry. So now I'm just going through and changing the color. I want it to be kind of a darkish brownish red color. So just going in and picking the color. You can mess around with I usually paint with inflate turned on, and you can go in the brush stroke and apply an alpha on top of that to get varying different effects. You can see I'm just using airbrush and then using a texture on top of that to get kind of little veiny textures. You can turn spray on, which mixes the base color with black and white, and then you can turn color spray on, which mixes the base color with multiple color variations, which is nice to get some color variation in there from the start. We're going to get into, we just wrapped up the poly painting, and we're just going to get into some Fibermesh. I don't really use this too much, but I've started to use it a bit more lately while doing a lot of these primates and experimenting with it. At first I didn't really click with me, but after messing around a bit more, you can get some pretty interesting results. I don't think it's perfect yet, but it kind of gets you in the ballpark, and then you can enhance it with photos and illustrate on top of it to get really natural looking hair and fur for a lot of creatures. So it's definitely a cool tool to know about and utilize where needed. So right now I'm just masked off the area I want to have fur, and then once you're happy with that, go down to Fibermesh, and I picked a base one. I just went to Lightbox Fibers and picked a kind of a preset one that's kind of in the ballpark again of what I want, and just doing a test render. In the viewport, it won't show up as 100% what it looks like. It'll only show up when you render it, so you can see what the final results will look like. And then I'm just going in there and adjusting the length, the coverage, and gravity to get the overall basic feel that I want, and just continue to do little tests to see where it's at. So the coverage is maybe a little too much, turn that down, do another test. But again, you can just mess around with these. Max fibers is the amount of fur that's going on, that's being covered all over, and you can kind of just start messing around with these and see what each one does. I'm noticing there's too many random hairs coming on the bottom, so you can just continue to mask off areas and remove masked areas so that you get the fur exactly where you want it. And it's starting to look, again, in the ballpark, but needs a bit more fur, probably a bit longer, to kind of head in the area of some of the reference we're looking at right now. And so just it kind of gets to a weird point where it's almost like you've sculpted your toy, you've painted it, and now you're combing the hair, like making some cool toy and just playing around with some hair that you've stippled in there or something. Now we've kind of poly painted our model, got some fiber mesh on there, kind of pose our character where we want it, adjust the lighting. I think this is a bit more toplit than what we had at the end of chapter 9. I'm thinking some sort of, I'm not decided if I want to do a kind of a side view or just kind of this 3/4 view. Just something about the profile really shows off the character of this this chimp. So I'm just trying to find the best view, maybe like a slightly low angle looking up at him. This is usually one of the harder parts for me, where this is the first thing someone's going to see. The director or whoever is going to look at this, and you really want everything to say exactly what you want to say. So the angle is very important. So just painting in some things by hand, painting in like some of the wrinkles, you know, accentuating and enhancing those, painting, making them darker, making some cuts and things on his lip, painting into some of the fur. You can see the Fibermesh hair is, I mean, it's all right, but it's definitely looks a bit unnatural. Sampling some photo source from our reference. Again, I could try to paint that, but there's so much irregularities and just so much variety and texture, and it's just, it would be extremely hard to try to replicate that by hand. So using photos as a base, texture gets you very close to what you need. And bring in some more different types of hair, and that's another thing to just pay attention to, is there's so many different types of hair on these guys, and don't just sample from one, sample it logically. So this type of hair on the chest should be on the chest of our guy. This type of hair on the shoulders looks a certain way. The hair on his face looks a different way, and just making sure to get all that where it needs to be. And so looking at other things I can sample from, maybe that stubble on the mouth, and really brighten the contrast and just turn that on a screen layer or something. So just resampling that kind of skin pigmentation. I kind of like the way that looks, and just copying that around. For that background, I'm actually using a noise, and then I'll blur that a little bit. It kind of creates an interesting, sort of like old drawings we had to do with airbrush in school, where it just has like this kind of spotted effect, which is just, again, a bit more texture and contrast in the background, which just adds a bit more visual interest. Really enhancing the silhouette, even though that's not what we got out of the ZBrush, just making it read a bit more to make a more compelling illustration. Sort of doing last minute tweaks and adjustments. Right now I'm going on with a lighten layer, and I do this typically when I'm finishing things up, is just to get a bit more color and life into areas. The ZBrush renders tend to be a bit black and dead to me, so I'm just adding in on a lighten layer some color in the areas that are particularly black and I know have a lot of thin skin that will subsurface scattering. I'm kind of faking it a little bit for the sake of making a more appealing illustration. Maybe a curve over top to tint and tone the overall color of the illustration. I'm not sure if I like that, though this is quite an effective technique. If you say, even if you just are doing black and white illustration, you just need some quick color, you can just throw on a couple different curves layers and get a pretty fast color image banged out for a deadline. Just seeing how it looks, letting it sink in. Again, as with everything we've done so far, just experiment, see what works, see what doesn't work, just have fun, explore, especially for something like this that's for yourself, hopefully. Just kind of go with the flow and have fun. I think there's just a few last minute things I do after this video, which is just adding in some sort of indication in the background of kind of like leaves or something, just as a little final touch to make a little more interest in that background. But I think that's about it. So thanks. See you next time.